Have you ever wondered why, when descending into the subway, you can't shake off a strange, sticky feeling of déjà vu, as if you're entering not a 20th century transportation artery, but an ancient temple or an underground palace that was simply adapted for the needs of the crowd? We've been lied to our entire lives. From the cradle, beautiful tales of the heroic labor of Soviet subway builders and the brilliant engineers of Victorian England were hammered into our heads. But what if I told you that the official history of subway construction is the most brazen and massive falsification in human history? What if these tunnels were built by no one in the 19th and 20th centuries, but were simply found, dug up, and cleaned of centuries-old dirt? Get ready, because today we will destroy the foundation of your faith in school textbooks. Let's transport ourselves to London. The official opening date of the world's first subway system is January 10th, 1863. Ponder this date. Mid-19th century. Horse-drawn carriages ride through the streets of London. Sanitation is in its nascent state. People are dying from cholera, and medicine treats with bloodletting. And at this very same time, according to the official version, these same people, armed only with picks, shovels, and enthusiasm, are laying complex engineering communications several kilometers long underground? Do you seriously believe in this? We are told that they used the cut-and-cover method. Allegedly, they dug up the street, built a tunnel out of brick, and filled it back in. But look at the old photographs that historians shamefully call construction shots. What do you see there? Look closely at the details. We see not a construction site, but excavations. We see giant arched vaults protruding from the earth, already finished, already formed, but covered with clay and soil. The workers in these photos are not laying bricks, they are cleaning them. They look like ants crawling on the bones of a dead leviathan. Let's turn on logic and a calculator, which official scientists dislike so much. To build the first 6 kilometers of the London Underground, hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of soil had to be removed from the Earth's depths. Where did it go? Can you imagine this volume? This is a mountain as tall as an Egyptian pyramid. Where are the documents about the removal of this soil? Where are the landfills where it was dumped? London is a cramped, densely populated city. If thousands of carts with soil were circulating through the streets around the clock, the city would have been stuck in an eternal traffic jam for decades. But the chronicles are silent about this transport collapse. No one complained about mountains of dirt. Why? Because the soil was not removed on such a scale. It was simply cleaned out of already existing corridors. Moreover, pay attention to the brickwork of the London Underground. These are millions, tens of millions of bricks of perfect shape and firing. Where were the factories capable of producing such a volume of products in a short time frame? The logistics of delivering such a quantity of building materials by horse to the center of London is a task impossible even for a modern transportation system, let alone the 19th century. And now for the most interesting part. Do you know how they explained the necessity of building the subway in London? Allegedly, the city was suffocating in traffic jams. But allow me. The population of London in the early 19th century was just over 1 million people. Did 1 million people in carriages really create such a collapse that it required digging dozens of meters deep into the earth? This is absurd. The real reason they went underground was different. They knew there was something there. In the mid-19th century, the so-called Great Stink occurred, an event when the Thames began to emit an unbearable stench. Officially, due to sewage. But it was under the pretext of creating a new sewage system that engineer Joseph Bazalgette began large-scale excavation work. And lo and behold, along with the sewage system, the subway suddenly appears. What a coincidence. Doesn't it seem to you that the sewage system and the subway system are parts of a single, gigantic underground network, inherited by us from a previous civilization, which was simply divided by partitions and given different names? Look at the quality of execution. Perfect tunnel geometry, complex transitions, magnificent acoustics. And this was built by people who returned in the evening to homes heated by coal and read by candlelight. The technological gap between what we see underground and how people lived on the surface is colossal. It's as if Papuans with spears found a crashed spaceship and started using its compartments as huts. We are those Papuans. We descended into the dungeons, hung our electric light bulbs on hooks driven into ancient stone, ran trains on ready-made tracks, and proudly declared, "We built this." But London's lies are just the beginning. A real shock awaits us when we transport ourselves to the 1930s, to the capital of the Soviet Union, where an even grander spectacle was unfolding. Why did subway construction begin in Moscow specifically in the 1930s? The official version states, transportation necessity. But wait, Moscow in the early 30s was a city barely recovering from revolution and civil war. The population lived in barracks and communal apartments. Trams ran on the streets, and there were practically no cars. What transportation necessity? Why would a country lacking bread and steel invest colossal, unimaginable resources in underground palaces adorned with marble, granite, and semi-precious stones? Have you ever wondered about the cost of finishing the first Moscow metro stations? These are not just transport hubs, they are temples. No one in their right mind would build a utilitarian object with such luxury unless that object was already there, waiting to be dusted off. Pay attention to the depth of laying. 30, 40, 50 meters and deeper. Why? Why drive passengers so deep, spending millions on escalators and ventilation systems, when it would have been possible to build a cheap surface metro or run it at a shallow depth? We are told complex soils, quicksand, underground rivers. But if the soils are so complex and dangerous, then digging at such a depth with the technologies of the 30s is suicide. It is technically impossible without modern tunneling equipment, which the USSR simply did not have then. We are told tales of tunneling shields bought in England and heroic Komsomol members with jackhammers. But any engineer will tell you, the tunneling speed stated in Soviet reports is unrealistic for manual labor and primitive mechanization. They went through meters of granite and clay at such a speed as if they were cutting butter with a hot knife. Or perhaps they weren't cutting? Perhaps they were simply scooping loose alluvial soil out of already existing granite pipes. Let's pause and look closely at the facts that are on the surface, but which we stubbornly refuse to notice due to the veil of official propaganda. Take any photograph of the opening of the first stage of the Moscow Metro in May 1935. What do you see? Jubilant crowds, portraits of leaders, and incredible, dazzling luxury of the stations. Marble, granite, bronze, crystal, smalt mosaics. These are not transport stops. These are palaces of Roman emperors. And now remember what was happening in the country at this time. Collectivization had just ended. There was famine in the villages. Industry was just getting on its feet. The rationing system for food had only recently been abolished. The country was living in a mode of strict economy. And at this moment, the state spends hundreds of tons of choice marble and bronze to decorate an underground space? Do you really believe that the Soviet government, pragmatic and cynical, would bury billions of rubles in the ground for the aesthetic pleasure of the proletariat, who often had nothing to wear? This is economic nonsense. No ideology would justify such insane expenditures, unless these palaces were acquired by the Bolsheviks for free. Imagine a scenario that explains all the inconsistencies. The Bolsheviks did not build these stations from scratch. They restored them. This is why the construction times for the first stage seem so fantastic. According to official data, the decision to build was made in 1931, and trains were launched already in 35. 4 years. 4 years too, under conditions of complex hydrogeology, without experience, without modern technology. Dig 11 kilometers of tunnels and build 13 palatial stations. Compare this with modern rates, when a single station, even with computer-controlled and laser-guided tunneling shields, takes 5 or 6 years to complete. Was a Komsomol member with a pickaxe really more productive than a modern tunneling complex? They try to convince us that enthusiasm can violate the laws of physics. But the truth is that cleaning an existing corridor of silt and dirt, laying rails and hanging chandeliers can be done in 4 years. However, cutting through granite and concrete, removing millions of tons of rock, and creating complex engineering infrastructure from scratch, that is impossible. Let's talk about materials. Official history proudly states that granite and marble were brought from all over the Soviet Union. The Urals, Karelia, Crimea, the Caucasus. Imagine the logistical chain of the early 1930s. Railways are overloaded with transporting coal, steel, and bread. Locomotives are old, and there aren't enough tracks. And into this transportation hell, echelons of decorative stone are inserted. Thousands of wagons with marble that needs to be quarried, cut, polished, and delivered to the center of Moscow without chips or cracks. Where were the stone processing plants capable of handling such a volume? They didn't exist. The stone processing industry in the USSR was artisanal. So where did these perfect slabs that clad kilometers of walls come from? The answer is simple and terrifying. They were already there. The walls of ancient underground structures were originally clad. Soviet workers merely cleaned them, replaced damaged sections, and added communist symbolism. Pay attention to how often antique motifs appear in the subway's decor, which are completely inconsistent with the constructivist aesthetics of the 1930s. Columns, capitals, arches, coffered ceilings — this is the style of a lost civilization, hastily adapted to the needs of a new ideology. And now look at the technical equipment. Ventilation. The ventilation system of the Moscow metro is a masterpiece of engineering. The air underground is completely renewed several times an hour. Shafts, blowers, filters — we are told that all of this was designed and built by Soviet engineers who, just yesterday, were studying in parish schools. But any aerodynamic specialist will tell you that calculating such a system for a branched network of tunnels requires extremely complex mathematical calculations, which at that time were on the verge of possible without computers. And if a mistake were made, passengers would simply suffocate. But the system worked immediately and flawlessly. Why? Because the air ducts were part of the original design. The ancient builders, whoever they were, created these underground spaces not as a transportation system, but as autonomous shelters. These were cities beneath the earth, designed for the long-term habitation of millions of people in conditions where the planet's surface became uninhabitable. Recall the so-called quicksand, water-saturated sands that allegedly posed the main problem for subway builders. Why did engineers even decide to lay the route through these highly dangerous sections? Why fight nature, freeze the soil with liquid nitrogen, risk workers' lives, if it was possible to simply bypass dangerous areas or change the depth of laying? Logic suggests, find the easy way. But they persistently went into the water. Why? Because they were not laying a new path. They were following a trace. They were excavating an already existing tunnel that had been flooded or damaged by a past catastrophe. They could not turn aside because the ancient road led precisely there. They were hostages of an old map, which we today call the subway plan. This also explains the strange curves of the lines and the changes in elevation, which seem illogical from the perspective of modern design, but make sense if we are restoring ruins. Another egregious fact is the absence of spoil heaps in Moscow. We have already talked about London, but in Moscow the situation is even more obvious. The city center, dense development. If millions of cubic meters of rock had been extracted from underground, Moscow should have been covered in slag heaps. Where did this soil go? We are told they were transported by barges, filled ravines, built embankments. But where are the photographs of these giant convoys of trucks or submarines packed with clay? They don't exist. There are staged photos of happy subway builders in clean overalls, but no chronicle of the dirty, heavy work of removing earth on an industrial scale. This is because there was almost nothing to remove. The main volume of tunnels was hollow. The dirt was only sediment, the consequences of that very mud flood that historians are silent about. The subway wasn't dug, it was vacuumed. Look at Mayakovskaya Station. Steel arches, futuristic design, spaciousness. Corrugated stainless steel is used in the decoration. This is expensive, high-tech steel, which in the 1930s was a strategic resource for aviation and the military industry. And it's used to decorate a subway station? This is as if today subway walls were clad with titanium from space rockets. Where does such extravagance come from? Or perhaps these stainless steel structures are the load-bearing framework of an ancient structure that was so perfect and undamaged that it was decided not to hide it under plaster, but to present it as an achievement of Soviet design. We walk inside a giant mechanism whose purpose we do not fully understand, and naively believe that it is just a beautiful decoration for a commute to work. But let's move away from bricks and marble and look at what historians are afraid to even whisper about. Let's look at demographics. This is the area where the official lie unravels most loudly. We are painted a picture of rapid industrial growth in the 19th century, when urban populations allegedly exploded. But if we open real statistical directories of those years, and not rewritten textbooks, we will see a strange picture. In the mid-19th century, precisely when the mass construction of the subway in London and the reconstruction of European capitals allegedly began, the world was experiencing the consequences of some global catastrophe. Look at photographs of cities from that time. Deserted streets with no people. St. Petersburg, Paris, Rome, London. In the photographs of the 1860s, the cities look deserted. Where are the crowds of workers who were supposed to dig tunnels? Where are the millions of city dwellers for whom these gigantic underground networks were built? In the photographs, we see rare passers-by who look like ragamuffins against the backdrop of majestic ruins. There is a theory, and it is gaining more and more corroboration, that a global cataclysm occurred in the early 19th century. Researchers call it the clay or mud flood. Some catastrophic force covered cities with a layer of soil and clay several meters deep. This is why the first floors of old buildings in the center of Moscow, London, or Prague are submerged underground and converted into basements. Windows going into the sidewalk, doors leading nowhere underground. You see this every day, but your brain refuses to analyze it because it's simpler that way. And subways are nothing more than the lower levels of a single urban infrastructure that survived best because they were hermetically sealed. When the water and mudslide receded, the surviving people, like ants, began to dig out what was accessible. First the upper floors, then the streets, and then they stumbled upon descents downwards. Think about the technologies. We are told that the London Underground beneath the Thames was built using Mark Brunel's tunnelling shield. Allegedly, it was a wooden structure inside which people sat and dug earth while the shield was pushed forward by jacks. Can you imagine the pressure of water and soil at depth beneath a river? A wooden shield would have been crushed like a matchbox in the very first second. No manual jacks could have moved such a behemoth. This is a technical fairy tale for children. The reality is, the tunnels under the Thames and the Moskva River were always there. They were built from high-strength materials, concrete mixtures whose secret we still have not unraveled, and are capable of withstanding colossal pressure. We merely found the entrances, pumped out the water, and claimed authorship for ourselves. And here we come to the most terrifying question. Why were these tunnels built in the first place? If we discard the version with trains, which seems ridiculous for a civilization that possessed atmospheric electricity and etheric technologies, then what was it? Look at the subway map. It's a gigantic network encircling the city. Ring lines, radial rays. This is the diagram of a giant circuit board or an energy circuit. Perhaps these tunnels served as waveguides. Perhaps it wasn't people in stuffy carriages who moved through them, but energy or information. Or perhaps it was a global-scale pneumatic mail system, about which science fiction writers of that time wrote, as if recalling a lost past. We are using a microscope to hammer nails. We ran primitive electric trains through channels that were perhaps intended for teleporting matter or generating a planetary defense field. Recall the strange story of Dzerzhinskaya Station, now Lubyanka, in Moscow. Builders allegedly encountered insurmountable difficulties and could not construct the central hall, leaving 2 dead-end tunnels. But then, 40 years later, the hall was suddenly completed. The official version states, new technologies emerged. The alternative version sounds far more ominous. They simply couldn't open the hermetic door leading to the central hall right away. It took them 40 years to break into the ancient bunker's defense. The metro is full of such unfinished projects, and abandoned shafts where diggers and researchers are not allowed. What are they hiding there? Mountains of bones of those who died during the flood? Or working mechanisms of ancient gods that hum in the darkness, providing the city with an unknown vibration that we mistake for the noise of trains? We have been turned into consumers of false history. We have been told that we are the pinnacle of evolution, that we built this world. But the truth is that we live on the ruins of titans. We are a scavenger civilization. We settled empty houses. We descended into empty tunnels. We appropriated others' achievements. Notice how rapidly architecture is degrading. Compare the Stalinist empire style of the 30s metro with the wretched tiles of the 60s stations, the so-called centipedes. If we were developing, why did our buildings become progressively more primitive and ugly? The logic of progress dictates complexity and embellishment. The logic of degradation, simplification. We didn't learn to build better. We simply stopped being able to restore what we found. The reserves of ancient materials ran out. Specialists who knew how to work with the legacy died. And we began to sculpt stations from cheap concrete and bathroom tiles. This is not progress. It is decline. The global network of subways is a single system. London, Moscow, Paris, New York, Tokyo. Everywhere the same depths, the same arched vaults, the same track gauge. As if one architect designed all the underground spaces of the world. Official science explains this by borrowing experience and standardization. But how could countries separated by oceans and hostility standardize something in an era when a letter took weeks to travel from Europe to America? It's impossible. This network was built by a single global civilization, an empire that knew no borders, which we today call Tartary or Atlantis. They built a transportation network connecting continents underground. Yes, there's a hypothesis that subway tunnels don't end in dead ends beyond the terminal stations. They continue further, under oceans, under mountains. An ancient global hyperloop that we sealed off with concrete plugs because we fear who might come from the other side. And now, let's take a deep breath, because the air we breathe in the subway is permeated not with creosote and dust, but with fear and the memory of a war that wiped our predecessors off the face of the earth. Have you ever noticed the gigantic hermetic gates in old stations? These multi-ton metal monsters capable of sealing off a tunnel in a matter of seconds. We are told that this is protection against floods, or, in later versions, against a Cold War nuclear strike. But these gates were there long before the invention of the atomic bomb, as we understand history. Look at their construction. These are not just doors. They are spacecraft airlocks. The mechanisms of their drives are hidden deep within the walls, and modern engineers often don't even know how to repair them if they break. So they are simply preserved and painted over with a 10th layer of paint. These doors scream to us that the subway was originally designed not for transporting clerks to work, but as a global survival system. It is an ark. It is a doomsday bunker, built by a civilization that knew the sky would soon fall to earth. We behave like classic adherents of a cargo cult. Do you know what that is? During World War II, natives on Pacific Islands saw American soldiers building airfields and receiving cargo from the sky: food, clothing, equipment. When the war ended and the soldiers left, the natives began to build mock airplanes and towers out of straw and sticks, hoping that the gods would send them gifts again. We are doing the same thing. We found a gigantic, high-tech system of transportation, communications, and shelters. We haven't understood 10% of its capabilities. We simply adapted it to our primitive needs, ran our rattling carriages through it, and called it progress. We are children who found a Kalashnikov rifle and use its sight to crack nuts, not even suspecting that this thing can shoot. Think about World War II. London, 1940. German bombardments. Where do Londoners hide? In the subway. Moscow, 1941. Germans near Moscow. Where is the command headquarters located? In the metro. At Kirovskaya station, now Chistya Prudi. Why was Stalin so confident in his safety while in Moscow? Because he knew the Soviet bunker could be breached, but the granite vaults of the ancient era would withstand any blow. The metro was not just used as a shelter, it remembered its true function. In those moments, history dropped its mask. People instinctively returned to the womb of Mother Earth, to those very corridors that saved the remnants of humanity during the previous apocalypse, 100 or 200 years ago. And here we come to the most terrifying demographic failure. Where are all the adults? When researching the 19th century, we constantly encounter the phenomenon of orphanhood. A huge number of orphanages, boarding schools, the so-called orphan trains in the United States, which transported thousands of children to settle the desolate territories of the Wild West. Where did so many children without parents come from? Where did millions of adults disappear to? The answer is terrifying. They perished. They didn't make it to the subway. The catastrophe, whether a war of gods, a plasma strike, or that very mud flood, destroyed the adult population, leaving only a handful of survivors and millions of dispossessed children on the surface. The metro is a silent witness to that tragedy. Those who managed to take shelter behind the hermetic doors survived, but there were few of them. Perhaps they became the new elite, the guardians of knowledge, who then rewrote history, invented a fairy tale of slow evolution, and made us forget that we live on a graveyard. Imagine the scale of the cynicism. The authorities perfectly know that we live in a period between catastrophes. They know that this world is a temporary backdrop. That is why they are so nonchalant about the impermanence of modern construction. Why build for centuries if everything will be washed away or burned again in 50 years? But the metro is different. They preserve the metro. They constantly expand and repair the metro, but not just for the sake of it, but by biting into old, preserved branches. Have you heard legends about Metro 2 in Moscow? About secret lines leading to government bunkers and underground cities in Ramenki? Officially, it's a state secret. But conspiracy theorists know. These are not new constructions. These are simply deeper levels of the same ancient system that the elite kept for themselves. For us, the upper level, where we commute to work. For them, the lower levels, where there are autonomous energy sources, food storages for centuries, and libraries with the true history of humanity. We feel it. Descending the escalator, you feel the pressure change, the energy shift. A strange anxiety envelops you, or, conversely, an unnatural hypnotic calm. Subway stations are designed as psychotronic resonators. The shape of the vaults, the pattern of the mosaics, the frequency of the train's hum, all of this affects consciousness. Perhaps the metro is a giant machine for suppressing will. Every day, millions of people descend underground, pass through metal detectors that actually scan not weapons, but biofields, and enter the zone of low-frequency emitters. We emerge from the metro tired, suppressed, obedient cogs in the system. We think it's work fatigue, but in reality, it's the result of processing in the underground circuit. The ancients used these resonators for healing and enlightenment, but those who seized power now have retuned the frequencies. They have turned a temple into a slaughterhouse for human souls. Look at the subway map of any major city. These are not chaotic lines. It's a mandala. It's an occult symbol superimposed on the city map. The circle line closes the circuit. Radial lines collect energy from the outskirts and direct it to the center. Where? To the Kremlin? To the City of London? To the Vatican? Wherever there is a subway, there is a center of power. These underground spaces drain our life force to feed the system that controls the world. We are batteries. We voluntarily descend into the matrix every day, pay money for it, and consider it convenient transport. But in reality, we are participating in a ritual whose meaning is hidden from us. And the most terrible thing is that we don't even try to look around. We look at our phones, afraid to raise our eyes to the cyclopean masonry of the walls, which remember the touch of Atlantean hands. We are afraid to see the truth, because if we admit that our grandfathers didn't build the subway, we will have to admit that our entire life is a lie.